So welcome to our speakers, Caroline Stevens, Robin Bloch, and Trisha Hackett, and welcome to all of you from all corners of the world. As many of you attending this session are actually on the path to becoming a development practitioner, or actually thinking about it, this session is totally looking at the critical role of planning practitioners in these challenging times and beyond. So let me give you a short biography of our speakers today. We have Professor Caroline Stevens. She's our honorary professor for urban health. She has 25 years research career focusing on links between urban equity, environment and health, and on social and environmental justice. She has lived and worked in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and has advised a number of international UN agencies. Her research support NGO groups across the world, and she has served on a number of executive boards. Then we have Robin Bloch. He is technical director for CAWI. He has over 30 years of experience globally as an urban and regional planner and economist. He specializes in spatial and land use planning, economic development, and environmental management, sustainability, and resilience. Robin has delivered services to the African Development Bank, the World Bank, DFID, Cities Alliance, the Danish International Development Agency, Europe Aid, Global Facilities for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, and probably many, many more institutions, which I cannot completely list here, but essentially also advising a lot of various city governments. We have also Trisha Hackett joining us from Medellin. She's a DPU alumni who graduated 12 years ago. She is Sustainable Urban Development Advisor at International Urban Cooperation and is a technical expert for urban action planning at GIZ. She has expertise in city-level knowledge transfer partnerships, public policy, public sector innovation, city-to-city cooperation, and management and organizational development within and in over 60 cities across Europe, Latin America, North America, and Asia. So welcome, Caroline, Robin, and Trisha, and thank you so much for your time today. I will pose each of you a question, and so we'll go through the questions, and then I urge our participants to share any questions that they might have in the Q&A, and I will then facilitate that. I'll moderate then the answer questions. So let's start with Caroline. Caroline, as a health expert who has worked extensively with planners, what do you think is the role of planning practitioner in the COVID era and beyond?
Thanks very much, Rita. I'll be very brief. I know I've only got 5 minutes. I mean, effectively, we're in this kind of living experiment with COVID, but when you posed me this question the other day, I was thinking, actually, this is not the first time that cities have been faced with infectious disease. This is not the first time that planners have had to think about it. And so I think maybe the first thing to think about is learning from history. Perhaps the interesting thing about what's happening now is the fact that we've got the trends of globalization, meaning people can move around much more from city to city, which facilitates spread of disease. But then if we're thinking about planning on the basis of health, that's been around for centuries. Perhaps the other thing that's different for us is the scale of cities and the density of cities and the level of inequalities in cities. So doing a kind of plan for urban health in London is a completely different thing to doing it in Medellin in Colombia, doing it where I was living in Tucumán in Argentina, or in Accra in Ghana, or in some of the smaller towns across Asia and Africa, or in the mega cities. I lived and worked in Calcutta for many years as well. The other thing I would say is that we mustn't, when we start to think about focusing on health, we mustn't forget that actually we need to think not just about COVID, but we need to think about how we deal with other important health issues that people face in cities, mental health, for example. Obesity is a major epidemic across the world as well. We don't think about those things in the same way as we do infectious disease, but perhaps the COVID experience is giving us the opportunity to rethink planning around how we should see cities in the future. And then the final thing I would also say is we have an enormous opportunity for planners and health professionals to come together now to think about sustainability in a more serious way than we're doing. Sustainability for me isn't simply recycling as we were doing this morning with our bins outside. It's around completely changing the way we see the development process and see the way that we're dealing with our planet. So urban professionals have a responsibility now to think about how we support people to make decisions that facilitate sustainability in the future. And that effectively means us all working together. So I think COVID gives us the opportunity to look back, learn from historical situations. I think it gives us the opportunity to think about health more generally for people. And I think it gives us the opportunity to open the Pandora's box seriously of sustainability and the role of urban people in achieving that. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Caroline. Caroline, can you guys hear me? Yeah. Yes. Okay. So thank you for that. Now, Robin, who has been a development planner and working across many regions for 30 years, and you have this great longitudinal view of planning profession. How is it changing, and where is the potential for it to have a real impact, you reckon?
Yeah, no, thanks, Rita. I thought about this in relation to some work that I'm doing at the moment, which I'll come on to, and also the discussion that's now occurring about urban development in consequence of the pandemic of COVID-19. And I'm sure everybody who's listening has been following the discussion, and a large part of that discussion has been around the issue of contagion in relation to urban density. And there's been an enormous amount of material, and this takes off from some of what Caroline has been saying, an enormous amount of material or opinion, let's say, about urban density, about how that contributes or doesn't contribute to infection levels, let's say. Much of that has been quite unsatisfactory. It's been people writing from preset positions. So on the one hand, you've had, urbanists, so-called, or spatial determinists, if you like, saying that densities are absolutely necessary and will not, change, and their functionality will not change. And then against that, you've had people extolling the virtues of less densities. You could call them sprawl lovers. And there's been a lot of heat, but not much light, to use that cliche. And that got me thinking about how the profession is changing. And one thing that I think in the last couple of years, at least, is that the planning profession has moved towards using much more and varied sources of evidence in the planning work that we do. And on a day-to-day level in the work that I do for the clients that Rita mentioned, in urban development, there's been a great deal of research funded by academics and also by the international institutions, the IFIs and the bilateral development partners. And that work needs to be used actually to develop positions and proposals in our work. And I think you could say that that's always been the case, but with this longitudinal view, I think that there's been much more of that over the last, let's say, decade or so. And it means an increasing sophistication on the part of planners to use that kind of evidence well. I'm busy working on a report. We're doing a study and a plan for the Jinja, Kampala and PG corridor in Uganda. And I must say the evidence that we need to bring to bear for that is quite overwhelming in some ways, and it's a challenge to deal with it and to deal with it well and in an even-handed way. That leads into the second point, which is in the last years, I think our profession has become much more overtly political, and that's required and it's needed. And, you know, sometimes that's discussed in terms of political economy analysis, which is merely a technique for working with political factors and dynamics. But I would say the profession and people who are going into the profession will need to engage with politics much more than was previously the case at different levels, institutional through electoral, let's say. And our planning work is in the intersection of all of those dynamics. And underpinning those dynamics, of course, is a range of interests, power relations, and cleavages around gender, around sexual orientation, around class, ethnicity, race, all of which require a great deal of sensitivity and understanding to be able to perform your role as a planning practitioner in a yeah, if I could say in the words of John Friedman, who was my mentor, in a just way. So this relationship between evidence, technical if you like, and the political, I think is where the practice is increasingly heading. In terms of impact, given that, I think that I won't go into detail about impact. I was speaking to a colleague of mine yesterday who's working on the Sudri NERP, which is the Nepal Urban Resilience Program, which actually DPU is part of the group, the consortium implementing. And they have adjusted over the course of the last couple of months, both technically and politically, you could say, and are working far more in response to the COVID-19. The planning work is now in response. It is dealing with creating more resilient and sustainable urban settlements where they're working. I won't go into the details of how the mechanisms that they're using or the techniques, but the profession is capable of adaptation in that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Those three elements that you've just, well, quite a few that you have highlighted, you know, the political reading and being able to actually navigate this political landscape, being part of producing robust research which is actionable, and understanding the different intersection in which we work are really absolutely key. And I think, as you said, you know, these are very much where we have to also align training and practice later on.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So let me go to Trisha. Hi, Trisha.
Hi, I'm
so
back.
Trisha, you graduated from the DPU in 2008. So
yes,
there's a lot of people here that will be watching, listening, because you actually graduated during the financial crash. Not
yes.
that dissimilar to where we are heading now. So you directly experience what it means to be doing an MSc in uncertain times. And
yeah,
really the question for you is, what skills do you practitioner actually need to tackle?
Yeah.
Firstly, emerging into an uncertain environment in the workplace,
yeah.
but also this you need to recover from this economic and health crisis, as well as the multiple issues that you need to address globally.
Thanks, Rita, and Caroline and Robin's comments really resonated with me as well. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I also was going to mention that. I think, you know, I remember just starting my MSc at the DPU when the financial crash was happening, and everyone was kind of in a bit of shock. And I think it's similar, although lots of differences to the moment that we're having now. But I think I'd like to say that I guess very DPU style is that when I think about, I kind of bristle a little bit sometimes about the skills, because I think we get very easily caught up in, you know, those kind of very concrete ideas of what a skill is, what GIS mapping, or these things that involve tools. And I would say, first of all, that the skill that planning practitioners need to come to their work with is a ethos and mentality that they aren't the only experts in the room. So it's very much about challenging power dynamics up front, acknowledging, very DPU style, the multiplicity of knowledges and expertise and experience that need to be brought to the table in an equitable way, which isn't easy. But I think that, that's the starting point of a skill, in embracing uncertainty, which seems kind of antithetical sometimes in a planning environment, but the whole world is getting a big lesson in that now. Flexibility in personal level, going to the grocery store has been, planning to go to the grocery store has been, become tricky. So, being able to be flexible and adapt in our personal as well as our professional lives. So, and very connected, it's all very interconnected. Practitioners need to be able to meaningfully and skillfully listen and connect to the people who are principally affected by whatever issue that you're working on, whatever project, related to this, the skills of observation and quietness rather than jumping to a conclusion, the kind of old style planning where you just see a problem and you, as an expert, you solve it. Seeing the interconnectedness and interrelatedness of urban systems. I'm right now convening similar kind of technical sessions with practitioners in cities who work in mobility, who work in public health, who work in economic development. And those convenings and those seminars are around tackling and recovering from the COVID-19 and post-COVID-19. And what we see is that if we're looking at transit and mobility, okay, so who uses the transit, when and why, what are their needs, looking at gender, physical barriers and safety, same for cyclists and pedestrians, how do you create infrastructure that people are able to safely use, lots. And then we come to the tool side of it, lots of tools. So when you have this mindset of not being the only expert in the world and are at the table and embracing this kind of the multiplicity of knowledges, and then so many things have become really mainstream in planning in the toolbox as well. So your user journey mapping, user-centered design, participatory mapping, participatory budgeting, those things that were kind of more on the avant-garde 10 or 15 years ago, I think have become really mainstream in the planner's professional toolbox. So I could go on, but I think I should stop there, and so we can have time for questions. So I'll just stop there with thank you.
Before I move to the next question, do any of you have anything to reflect on what others were saying?
Nothing specific from my side, except to say that I agreed with everything.
Thanks. So let's talk about your own careers then, because I think everybody here is very interested. I mean, you all have such incredible careers and you got to where you are through very different loopholes and probably changes and shifts. And really what I would like to know is, how did you come to where you are today? What path did you take? What were the real decisions that you had to make and so forth? And also, well, we can later move to the recommendations, but what recommendations do you have for those that are really looking for a career in development? Maybe Caroline, would you like to go first?
Okay, I'll go first. To put my cards on the table, my grandparents were miners, and I was the first person in my family to go to university. And before I went to university, I went to India and worked in a leprosy colony, at which point I gave up medicine and had this kind of wild idea to become a journalist and document the world's inequalities. So I studied literature. And then I got back into medicine, but got back in through environmental epidemiology, which is around looking at what Robin was talking about, the impacts of big infrastructure decisions. So working on the impacts of mining programs, which is how I first started working a little bit with DPU, then starting to train architects and planners in how to measure the health impacts of what they were doing. And the key learning moments for me actually were, first of all, learning that this term development is both ahistorical and naive. Actually, it's not naive, it's extremely cynical. So it's a very cynical term. And if you're not very careful, you don't realize that you're joining what could loosely be described, and I know this is a DPU discussion, but it is a fairly neo-colonial enterprise if you don't think very carefully. And you can, as an expert, I agree completely with what Tricia was saying, you can get very drawn in to, particularly if you've got some training and you can call yourself an expert, you can get very drawn into the neo-colonial exercise of pretending that you know more than the people in the places that you work. And so I very much take on board Tricia and Robin's points about both power and about the toolboxes. And there are tools that you can use, but they're not easy tools, and they're very contested tools when you come to confront power. And particularly if you work on big donor-funded projects in a development industry context, those decisions are fairly constrained. So when you mean participation, you mean it in a very constrained way. So these are, and then I guess what I'd like to know from everyone who is in the room, we've got 55 participants. I'd like to know from those participants where they see their journeys going, because for me, it's been always about realizing that the tension of actually having the very inappropriate power of being able to make decisions over people's lives who in their turn cannot make decisions about my life. And that's it's both a responsibility, but it also makes you have the responsibility to think very carefully about your ethic. And I'd like to come back to that, but I want to stop there so that we can actually have some discussion. But two words stay with me and have stayed with me since I very first went to India, which is around my personal ethic and my personal coherence, and a word that I find really difficult, which is around integrity and professional and integrity. And the teaching I do at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which is where my main job has always been, is all around teaching around ethics and professional ethics, which I know you don't have a specific course in DPU around that, but I think it's a fundamental part of what we should all be talking about when we start to talk about careers in this industry called development. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Carolyn. I think it's very powerful that you're saying we're all in this neo-colonial project or enterprise, and really that we really need to consider the ethics of practice. So how do you navigate that exactly? Because it's quite a thin line in your own practice.
I'd like to hear from Robin and Tricia before I say any more, because otherwise I think I'd like to hear from them before, and then I'd like to hear from the participants as well. I'm happy to say something about that, but yeah.
Thank you. Or Tricia. Robin, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. Sorry, there was a bit of glitching there. No, just very briefly. I mean, there's been a sort of double movement for me, both geographically and in terms of the nature of working as a practitioner and as a researcher, I should say. So I started off as a graduate, well, I was a graduate student. I'm South African, a graduate student in the US. And thinking about it, impelled by the question, you know, the crucial thing for me was I was doing my PhD dissertation at UCLA, and Nelson Mandela was freed in 1990 and the ANC was unbanned. And that impelled me to a large degree. Obviously, I have friends and family in South Africa then and now, to go back to South Africa and work as a researcher stroke policymaker or policy developer and planner through the 1990s in South Africa, and particularly obviously after 1994, the ANC government. And I increasingly became interested in how policies, strategies were implemented, and I'm talking within the broad sphere of urban development. And so I became, with colleagues obviously, and more interested in the process of design of interventions, programs, projects, and then that led further into wanting to understand more and be a participant in the implementation of those kinds of initiatives. And that's obviously, as with everybody I'm sure on the call, that's quite a broad sphere of activity. And that interest or trajectory led me to working internationally as a planner or as a practitioner, planning practitioner over the last 20 years. So it was that kind of movement. And I think I'll stop there and then, you know, respond to questions as necessary and to take up some of the themes that Carolyn has introduced.
Thank you, Robin. Trisha?
Okay. Well, I originally studied political science, and I ended up working in development, which I completely agree with Carolyn is a very contested term, although I didn't think that at the time, but certainly have come to see that. Working internationally and working with NGOs, and had this idea of doing planning in the back of my mind for a long time, and finally came to the DPU, let's say, as a mature, which I think was really good for me, having had several different life experiences. And mention that because, and I think I'll make a nod here also to what Carolyn was saying about the DPU not having a specific ethics course. And I think one of the things that I thought when she said that, that's true. But what I felt in the DPU is that the ethics were very much part of the fabric. I studied urban development planning, and it was very much part of the fabric of present.
Trisha, sorry, we just lost you. Can you repeat that last question, the last sentence?
I guess this moves a little bit. Yes.
Sorry.
Ooh, I don't know what was the last thing that you heard. So I was just saying when I finished the DPU, and I guess maybe this is, hopefully you can hear me okay now. Maybe this is a bit of a recommendation as well, in terms of those who are seeking a career in planning. I found an organization who I wanted to work with, which is a research institute in London called the Young Foundation. But there was not a role related to what I wanted to do available, but there was a role related more to around organizational development and funding for the organization, which I had done previous to doing my master's degree. And So I decided to take that role, knowing that I didn't want to stay there in that role. So I think, you know, sometimes you need to look ahead at different possibilities. Usually the perfect role in the perfect organization. That was, so I ended up being the Young Foundation for a number of years, and being the director of applied innovation, and you know, lead very interesting projects, project community, which brought local authorities and housing associations, and working with communities, looking at sort of what are the factors that go into making new thriving communities, which ended up with a publication called Design for Social Sustainability, and things kind of went from there. But I think what's been important for me in my career is having clarity about where I wanted to place myself, kind of in a planning process. I knew I wanted to work at the intersection of policy and practice. I'm strongly interested in what happens kind of on the ground, so to speak, but I'm also interested in policy. So I've sought out roles and opportunities that that place me there, I guess. It's also about kind of playing to your strengths, because I think that is a good fit for me. What else did I want to say about that? And I mean, that is what, yeah, so, you know, being open to roles that might not be perfect, but moving in the right direction. And I think also, you know, with roles in projects, I think we've all had kind of imperfect, you know, jobs in the past, but there's also something to learn from that, learn from how you don't want to do things, and how things can be done better. So I think, you know, for me, the training that I had through the DPU was very much gave me the tools and the kind of the ability to go on that trajectory to really specialize, I guess, more in that planning space, kind of the praxis between policy and practice. So I'll stop there, because I think so just to make sure we have enough time. Thank you.
Thank you, Trisha. We have a few comments and questions, and someone who has been actually studying at the DPU is rightly saying professional ethics are most definitely part of the DPU fabric. So the question is really, you know, they're part of the training, but how much can you really, when you are facing those situations where you are in a career, you know, the tensions and conflicts that you face, and how much can you actually operate in an ethical way is not a question, it's just more of a comment, which is, it's going to be always an issue. But let me just go to a question. Someone's asking, most of you have practiced and researched in many developing countries, such as India and African cities. And how do you perceive the chances of the native professionals to play a critical role in the practice after and during COVID-19? Any of you would like to take that one?
I would point you, Ayele, to a very interesting article yesterday in The Guardian around racism within the aid sector, and a whole discussion around the fact that in the UN system, in most of the development sector, what you're calling native professionals, in other words, people from their own countries wanting to work on their own problems, are paid less and given less responsibility in the aid sector. And I think it's a massive issue that we need to deal with. It's also slightly odd. And I take the point that DPU doesn't think, well, DPU don't think they need to create a space to discuss professional ethics, but it is slightly strange that people have to come all the way to London to discuss Africa. I mean, we're actually going through a process in the London School at the moment, discussing how we decolonize. Speaking as the London School of Tropical Medicine was started as part of a colonial enterprise. So to have people there discussing how to decolonize our practice and our teaching is quite interesting. So as a short way of saying that, I think this is a huge Pandora's box that needs to be addressed. And I will send a link, perhaps Rita can share this with everyone, to a very interesting, anonymous actually, article yesterday in The Guardian talking about using the opportunity of the discussion around racism at the moment to discuss racism within the aid industry. And I think it's a massive discussion because in my experience working in India, I was working alongside incredibly highly educated, brilliant practitioners. We were working in UK taxpayers funded DFID programs where British professionals were put alongside the Indian professionals, but our role had more responsibility, which I never thought was appropriate. But we were in that setting, and I've also worked with Cowie and with Robin's firm in different settings, and it is a massive Pandora's box that we need to open. So in answer to your question, my response would be, I think this is about changing the nature of the debate, and that we have an opportunity now to start changing that. I mean, we cannot carry on pretending that institutions that have been around for several decades in the and have created lots of alumni from countries do not have professionals who are equally able to negotiate and create new ideas and new frameworks. And that's my answer to that one, I would guess.
Thank you, Caroline. Robin?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that, and I think that the COVID situation actually does open an opportunity and the discussions around racism open an opportunity to explore this Pandora's box. I think there's always been, and I think Caroline's referring to this, a kind of disjuncture between local consultants and international consultants. I don't like using the term experts. I mean, I think so, and that has been overstated to my mind a lot of the time, and I think that has diminished in my own experience in recent years, and I think that needs to be accelerated. We have to work on our, I seem to have frozen, so I don't know, can you hear me?
Robin, we can hear you.
Yeah, we now working, as we have to, virtually in teams on projects, which has got severe limitations. But I think that is the way that we're going to have to work, at least for the time being. And I think that it does pose opportunities for this discussion to continue and to actually improve in many ways.
Thank you, Robin. Trisha, do you want to add something?
I would just quickly say that yeah, I agree with what Caroline and Robin said as well, and that I'm working on a program now that's funded by the EU called International Urban Cooperation, which pairs European cities with global cities in India, China, Japan, Latin America, North America, working together on sustainable urban development. And I feel like it's just a great, I bring it up as because it's what I'm working on, but also as an example of a kind of a shift in mentality, because this program is specifically a knowledge sharing program where cities are on equal footing. This isn't about Hamburg and Guadalajara in Mexico, for example, who are one of the pairs that I work with. This is not about folks from Hamburg sending knowledge to Guadalajara. This is specifically when cities applied to be part of the program, and when they applied to be part of the program, they write in their application what it is that the city is good at and what they want to share with a European city or with a global city, and what they want to learn. And I think these kinds of programs are hopefully will become more mainstream. You know, I work with Mexican cities, with US cities and Canadian cities and European cities, and it's from the presumption of the standpoint that every city has something to learn and share from each other. And I think, you know, there needs to be a more mainstreaming of these kinds of programs, and that challenge that presumption of who had, you know, the knowledge being sent from the global north to the global south. Thanks.
Thanks, Trisha. This actually connects a bit to the next question, which is asking, in light of the fact that there is an intensive amount of planning and construction demand and room for development, research in developing countries, as opposed to developed countries, how do you think developing countries use the opportunity to shape their policies and planning practices? Who would like to take that one? Robin?
I'm not quite sure what the question is. Is it that there's more opportunity for developing countries to use that as a big shorthand to do so, or?
Yes, that's implicit in the question, that there's so much planning and construction currently happening. How can they use this opportunity to shape their policies and planning practices?
I think that you know, actors or interests have been doing that for some time now. You know, just to echo what Trisha was saying, and by the way, just for everybody involved, I think, Trisha, you'd be working alongside or with my ex-colleagues at ICF on the IUC, actually. So, I mean, I say that to make the point that this is actually not a small world, international planning, urban planning, whatever you want to call it, but it's for people who want to do it. It's a permeable world, you know, it's something that people can do. So I don't think that the policy making, the research that must underpin that, the evidence is necessarily dependent on the scale of construction or development. It's an ongoing process. It may catalyze more, you know, construction, urban development, whatever, may catalyze research and policy making into different questions, but it's not going to be a determining factor.
Thank you, Robin. Caroline, Trisha, do you have any comment on that, or shall I move to the next one? No? Okay, I can move to the next one. Someone's asking actually how to deal with the competitiveness and pressure within the development sector, which all the more likely to increase during the times of crisis.
Well, I'll have a go at answering that. I think in a sense, I mean, I've been very negative so far, but I think in a sense, we're in a different world. It is very competitive, it appears that way, but then it appears like as if we're in a natural experiment that gives the opportunity to completely shift a paradigm. So it's a question of how you negotiate your space if you're a young professional through that. And this is, in a sense, I'd like to answer the two other people. I think we're also in this very interesting moment where we've got two other questions, one around mixing up architecture with gender studies, which is very much what Robin was saying about being able to navigate different political spaces. And Trisha was saying she comes from political science moving into planning. And we're in a moment where the first question as well comes around being a social scientist moving into that space. In a sense, that's breaking down walls between disciplines in a way that makes more interesting professionals. And it makes professionals that can actually start to hear things that they wouldn't hear before. But then in my experience, certainly, you have to be able to have people around you who you can talk to when you find yourself in those situations of perhaps conflict with your personal and professional ethic and the situations you're dealing with. I remember quite a few years ago, David Satterthwaite, who is from IIED, but is also a professor in DPU, said to me, make sure that you've got people around who understand that you're not mad when you raise questions of professional ethic in situations. For example, making a decision that will negatively affect people who are disadvantaged in a city context, which I've been in that situation, working for my own government in different cities, and making sure that you have people around you, and DPU is a good environment for that, who understand those situations. And yes, you can get sucked into big machines, like, for example, the World Bank, or into some of the big development organizations, or even into some of the NGOs, which quite often are not, they have white horses and they ride around on them, but they don't necessarily have any different agenda to other organizations. But it's really a question of how you negotiate that space and keep people around you who understand why you're concerned about what you're concerned about. And that's a kind of very floppy kind of, yeah, that's a floppy thing to say, but that's kind of what I would say to the question that's being raised about competitiveness. It's kind of whooshy answer.
Trisha? Okay, let me move on to the next question. Someone's saying, to what extent will development practitioners be able to base their work on existing tools and knowledge in the development field? During these unprecedented times, I feel most design tools are in question, and the process of design and invention post-COVID era will be quite challenging. How can this be addressed in academia as well as in practice? Robin, Trisha, would you like to come in on this one?
The internet connection was bad for the last bit. So how can they be designed in, what was the last part of the question, Rita? Sorry.
Most design tools are in question, and the process of design and intervention post-COVID era will be quite challenging. So how can this be addressed in academia and in practice?
Well, I'll speak to the practice, because that's where I am. And I think I've been, as I mentioned earlier, that we've been convening these seminars with city practitioners, and I think it's been really interesting to bring together. I think that, you know, there's a lot of it, even though it's very challenging. I think Carolyn mentioned this earlier, probably Robin did as well. I mean, this is a moment where things are kind of splitting apart, if you will, and it's in difficult but also ways that we can see about how to reshape cities. I mean, how many articles have been written in the last 2 or 3 months, and will become like, this is our moment to reshape cities. You know, we've had sessions with mobility practitioners from Mérida, Mexico, and Bogota, and Hamburg, and talking about, wow, you've all probably read it about how temporary cycle paths are being installed. Bogota and Milan were two of the first cities who are putting in temporary cycling infrastructure, and then of course London. It's like, and they said from the beginning, we want to make this permanent. From very early on, making very quick decisions, and and also testing that out to see how that, for the residents of the city, how they feel about that, and then negotiating that space between economic recovery, when in order for restaurants to open, they need to use sidewalk space or maybe close a road, but then how does that affect congestion? And but I think we're actually in a moment where we have practitioners from different disciplines, they have to work together, because public safety and transit, and they're all over in economic recovery. They're all very more overlapping than ever, I think, in this pandemic. It's like it's an all hands on deck situation. So what I've seen has actually been very encouraging, actually, from the city level, like those who are actually making policies and implementing quickly decisions. In Chicago, making all transit free, so there's less contact. That has a big impact on the budget. Maybe they're not able to extend lines, but in the short term, it gives more people more accessibility and public, safety, more safety for the driver. So I think it's a really it's a very interesting moment, and from my perspective, also a very encouraging moment, and that's working with cities in lots of different places in the world.
Can I add to that, Rita?
Go ahead.
No, I completely agree with that. I think that this forces, in some ways, the situation as difficult and as tragic as it is in many ways, it forces a level of innovations. I would just say, though, that in all of that innovation, and it's not as if I know this, Tricia, that urban planners, practitioners are very good at generating those kinds of innovations. I think it's very important that the innovations are directed with and towards those who have less of a voice in urban planning. I'm working on a project in Missouri, in Lesotho at the moment, which is doing an urban plan for the city. And lots of the ideas that are generated prior to COVID-19 and after, ideas around livability, walkability, etc., are great. But, Missouri has something like 40,000 mostly female garment workers who already walk very long distances to and fro their workplaces. And so it's still keeping a view on, those who maybe are not that well represented in these discussions at this point. And the solutions that come from urban planners, which I tend to agree with, need to be very inclusive, need to not forget about the need for public transport, however that takes place, that it's not only, to use this example, non-vehicular, and that it becomes a very broad discussion, an inclusive discussion.
Thank you, Robin. Perhaps I could, since we have not so much time left, can I ask each of you to perhaps, as a closing, tell us a bit about what key recommendations do you have for those that are seeking a career in development? And those could be practical recommendation of how to go about it, but also more aspirational.
I'll let the planners go first, actually. Well, no, I don't mind, but.
Tricia, Robin?
I
Tricia,
can go. I would,
yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think, what I mentioned before is emphasize that, looking for just being open to different possibilities. It might not be the perfect role or the perfect project, but don't disregard it, because there might be some learning there. And I think, really be clear about what your interests are, what your passion is, playing to your strengths, because whatever role that you're going to be in is going to be challenging. So it's, if you're doing something that you feel really passionate about, it helps get through the tough times. Lots of times we apply for these sexy jobs and then we get into them and we find that they're sexy in title, but they're really, really hard on a day-to-day. So, and in turn, make sure that, you're meeting people and networking and being open to what possibilities are out there. And I think in concluding, I was going to mention this earlier, but I'll say it now. I mean, in terms of, how you approach your work, I think the qualities of openness and flexibility and compassion and inclusion, ability to admit that you don't know everything, and finally kindness. And if you bring those to your roles that you're passionate about, I'm sure you'll have success. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Robin?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And one of the things Trisha was saying earlier, which is that you don't be scared to experiment. You know, this is simultaneously international urban planning, or whatever you want to call it, quite a small world, but it's also, there's an enormous breadth of different institutions. Caroline was saying that a little bit earlier as well. Institutions, things that you can do, roles that you can play, which span research through to implementation, let's call it. And if I were going into this again, I would be looking for that breadth of experience and learning from those who are doing those different kinds of roles, particularly those who are, you know, in the institutions and the agencies and the representative bodies of the different groups that you're working with. So I'm very positive about that. I would encourage people not to lock themselves, if you're starting this, not to lock yourself into one particular role, but if you can, experiment. Finally, I'd encourage you all, everybody, to watch Halt and Catch Fire, which I'm the great TV show about the IT industry, which I'm finding very inspirational, retrospectively, about careers and innovation.
Thank you, Robin. It's always so interesting when you talk about, if you were to do this all over again, what would you do differently? But that will be such a long conversation. So I'll go to, unfortunately, this format does not allow us to expand further. But Caroline, would you like to tell us the key recommendations for those who are seeking a career in development?
I guess my key recommendation would be to jot down now what your real intentions are on a piece of paper and stick it on your fridge, and then keep going back to it, because I think it gets very easy to get sucked into what Robin called sexy and what Trisha called sexy jobs that turn out to be something you might regret doing in the future, or make you make decisions you might regret compared to your younger self. And I think Nietzsche had a point when he said, you know, work out whether you would do it all again, the eternal return. So make sure you don't regret anything. I have friends who've stayed in the UN many years and regret some of the decisions they've made. So I understand exactly why they regret them. And there are some decisions I've made that I regret now. So yeah, I would make sure you have obviously you can't foresee this, but just make sure you're clear in yourself what your agenda is and what your intentions are. Directly speaking to this word of getting involved in development and a career in development, just have that clear and always keep checking. That would be what I'd say.
Thank you, Caroline. And with that, unfortunately, we have to finish, but you highlight some extremely valuable points that leave much food for thought and will probably be subsequently informing some of the sessions, you know, around the ethics of practice, around the politics of knowledge and so on, and have been actually. There's a lot of webinars that even the DPU and other institutions have been precisely on those points, and how as practitioners we navigate that. So I would just want to thank you so much for all your time. I am conscious that this format is so one directional, but it's great to have had all your fantastic insights. Thank you, time. And for those participants, I would watch this space, because we will have our session will be possibly in 2 weeks' time. But watch the space when we advertise. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank
Robin,
you,
and
Trisha.
Thank you.
Caroline, Robin. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
It's been a pleasure. Fun to connect with the DPU.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot. Bye.